On a quiet August afternoon in 1945, two American colonels spent 30 minutes with a map and a pencil. They drew a line across the map, a line that would fracture a nation and ignite a war where the rules of combat and of humanity were left behind. Wave after wave of Chinese infantry screamed through the dark, sacrificing bodies for terror. Villages were erased in seconds by napalm, flames clinging to skin and soil alike. Prisoners of war were broken not with chains, but with confessions, forced to forget their own names. Welcome to the Journals of History. This isn't just the story of battle. It's the story of what happens when war stops aiming to defeat an enemy and starts aiming to destroy the human soul. The foundation of brutality, division, and desperation. The seeds of Korea's agony were planted 5 years before the first shot was fired. On August 15, 1945, as Japan surrendered, two American colonels, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonsteel, spent 30 minutes with a National Geographic map drawing an arbitrary line across the 38th parallel. This hasty decision, made without consulting a single Korean, would condemn an entire nation to decades of division and unimaginable suffering. By 1950, the peninsula had become a powder keg of competing ideologies. In the north, Kim Sun-eung, installed by Stalin, had consolidated power through purges that eliminated over 100,000 political opponents. His Korean People's Army was equipped with Soviet weaponry and trained in guerrilla warfare that emphasized deception and psychological terror. In the south, Syngman Rhee's regime, propped up by American support, had its own brutal record, massacring an estimated 30,000 suspected leftists on Jeju Island alone between 1948 and 1949. When North Korean forces crossed the parallel, they brought with them not just weapons, but a revolutionary approach to warfare that would exploit every human weakness, every moral scruple, every civilized instinct. Their opponents would be forced to respond in kind, creating a downward spiral of brutality that would leave the Korean peninsula scarred for generations. The poison of false surrender. The first diabolical tactic emerged within days of the invasion when North Korean forces began systematically exploiting one of warfare's most sacred protocols, surrender. On June 28, 1950, near the Han River, American forces watched in horror as what appeared to be wounded North Korean soldiers waving white flags and crying for help suddenly produced concealed grenades and detonated them among approaching American medics. William Dean would later write, "They turned mercy into a weapon. Every white flag became suspect. Every cry for help a potential death trap. Within a week, we stopped taking prisoners who looked too eager to surrender." The tactic was methodical in its psychological cruelty. North Korean infiltrators would dress in captured American uniforms, complete with dog tags stripped from corpses, and approach UN positions speaking broken English. They memorized basic phrases, "Don't shoot," American, and carried forged documents. Once inside defensive perimeters, they would signal enemy positions, sabotage equipment, or simply open fire at point-blank range. David Halberstam, in the book The Coldest Winter, would explore the horror. Once fear took hold, men wouldn't wait. They'd fire preemptively, then check whether it was friend or foe. The psychological damage was catastrophic. By August 1950, UN forces had developed such mistrust that they began firing on legitimate prisoners attempting to surrender. The 27th Regiment alone documented 17 incidents where genuine surrendering troops were killed due to tactical uncertainty. The North Koreans had weaponized humanity itself, turning compassion into a liability and mercy into a death sentence. The human wave. Terror through numbers. As autumn descended on Korea in 1950, Chinese volunteers under General Pang Du introduced a tactic so primitive yet so psychologically devastating that it would haunt veterans for decades. On November 1, 1950 at Unsan, UN forces encountered their first taste of this horror when 20,000 Chinese soldiers attacked in waves throughout the night, accepting catastrophic casualties to overwhelm defensive positions. The tactic was brutally simple. Waves of lightly armed infantry, often equipped with nothing more than rifles, grenades, and bayonets, would charge enemy positions in screaming masses. The first wave would absorb the initial defensive fire. The second would advance over their corpses, and successive waves would continue until defenders either ran out of ammunition or broke under the psychological pressure. During the siege of Chipyong-ni, Captain Anil Walker, who commanded a U.S. infantry company, described the surreal intensity of the enemy's nocturnal assault. Whistles, horns, sirens, and bugles sounded all around the perimeter. Chinese infantry began to close in, probing for weak spots. During the Korean War, Chinese forces perfected the art of night assault, launching infiltrations, often called short attacks between midnight and 4 a.m. to capitalize on defender fatigue. At the outset, bugles, whistles, bells, and gongs would sound in unison from multiple directions, part practical battlefield signal, part psychological terror, plunging defenders into confusion just before the attack commenced. Veterans recalled the crescendo of noise, grenades striking rocky terrain, the charge of rifle fire, and the howl of soldiers. A cacophony many described as the sound of hell. After one such attack, a U.S. Marine remembered, "I saw dead Chinese bodies for miles in the aftermath of the battle, capturing the brutal yield of these tactics." The tactic's effectiveness lay not in its military efficiency. Chinese casualties often exceeded UN losses by 10 to 1. But in its psychological impact, defenders reported nightmares, hallucinations, and complete mental breakdowns. The 23rd Regiment's medical officer noted a 400% increase in combat stress casualties following human wave attacks, with many soldiers becoming catatonic after being forced to kill hundreds of enemy troops in single engagements. Death in disguise. The booby trap campaign. By winter 1950, North Korean and Chinese forces had transformed the Korean battlefield into a landscape of lethal deception. Every object, every shelter, every seemingly harmless item became a potential instrument of death. The tactic was psychological warfare at its most insidious, turning the environment itself into an enemy. The terror began with the ground itself. Troops reported finding entire hillsides wired with pressure-sensitive mines and paths laced with tripwires so fine they vanished in the snow. Bunkers abandoned by the enemy often held deadly surprises. Grenades tied to taut strings triggered by the weight of a boot or the touch of a curious hand. What looked like discarded equipment could detonate with a flick of a latch. Some soldiers whispered about corpse bombs. Allegedly, enemy sappers had begun hollowing out bodies and packing them with explosives, positioning them where recovery was likely. These stories, difficult to confirm and often passed in hushed tones between patrols, added to the thick fog of paranoia that hung over the front lines. The mere possibility changed behavior, forcing men to second-guess even the fallen. The deception extended to every aspect of military life. Supply crates were rigged with explosives that detonated when opened. Abandoned equipment was booby-trapped with grenades that exploded when moved. Even personal items, letters, photographs, cigarettes were weaponized. Infante soldier Robert Henderson recorded in his diary, "Found a pack of Lucky Strikes in a destroyed bunker. Johnson went to grab them and lost his hand to a hidden grenade. They're turning our own desires against us. Water when we're thirsty, warmth when we're cold, tobacco when we're desperate for comfort." The most effective traps were the ones that struck at instinct. Objects left where someone would naturally reach. Shelters rigged just when soldiers needed rest. Entire units learned to approach even a canteen with caution, to eye every footprint with suspicion. The cumulative effect was a battlefield soaked in paranoia. Soldiers developed obsessive checking routines, examining every surface multiple times before touching anything. The 8th Army's psychiatric reports from early 1951 documented a new category of combat stress, environmental paranoia, where soldiers became incapable of trusting their surroundings. The fire that burns everything, napalm, and strategic incineration. As the Korean War escalated through 1951, the United States unleashed a weapon so indiscriminate, so utterly devastating in its effects that it would forever change the nature of modern warfare. Napalm. What began as a tool for destroying enemy positions evolved into systematic incineration campaigns that obliterated entire regions of Korea, turning the peninsula into a charred wasteland where civilians burned alongside combatants. Napalm, a jellied gasoline mixture that adhered to everything it touched while burning at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius, was deployed with mechanical precision and devastating effect. Between 1951 and 1953, American forces dropped 32,557 tons of napalm on North Korea, an amount that exceeded the total used in the Pacific theater of World War II. The substance clung to human skin like flaming adhesive, burning through to the bone while producing clouds of toxic smoke that suffocated those who avoided the initial flames. One U.S. pilot, Frederick Champlain, later recalled, "The first couple of times I went in on a napalm strike, I thought afterward, well, maybe I shouldn't have done it. Maybe those people I set afire were innocent civilians." But you get conditioned. A frame on his back lights up like a Roman candle, a sure enough sign that he's been carrying ammunition. The weapon blurred the line between combatant and civilian, lighting up fields, villages, and bodies with equal indifference. Targets were often little more than grid coordinates with vague reports of enemy movement. What followed was total incineration. The strategy was deliberate depopulation through terror. General Curtis Lame, architect of the campaign, openly stated, "We burned down every town in North and South Korea." Both towns suspected of harboring enemy troops were incinerated without warning or evacuation orders. Rural areas were systematically burned to deny cover and supplies to Chinese and North Korean forces. The horror was meticulously documented by survivors. Kim Sunung-soo, a farmer from Pyeongdong, described napalm's effect on his village. "The flames came at dawn. The fire fell like rain, but it didn't go out when it hit the ground. It stuck to everything. My neighbor ran from his burning house, but the fire was stuck to his clothes, his skin. He jumped in the river, but the flames floated on top of the water. He burned for 20 minutes before he died." Medical personnel recorded napalm's unique brutalities. Dr. Howard Rusk, who treated napalm victims, wrote, "The burns are unlike anything in medical literature. The jellied gasoline melts the skin, then continues burning the fat beneath. Victims often survive the initial burn only to die days later from infection, dehydration, or shock. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. American air crews reported severe psychological distress from witnessing napalm's effects. In the book Napalm, an American biography, historian Robert Neer discusses the use of napalm bombs. He notes that after a napalm run, pilots were often given a cold beer while their armaments were replenished, and the plane was back in the air within 20 minutes. This routine highlights the normalization of such missions among pilots. The tactic's effectiveness was undeniable, but morally catastrophic. Entire regions of North Korea were depopulated through systematic burning. The city of Pyongyang was 75% destroyed. Hungam was completely obliterated, and rural areas were so thoroughly incinerated that refugee columns had no villages to flee to. American intelligence reports estimated that napalm campaigns created over 2 million internal refugees and killed approximately 635,000 civilians. Korean civilians developed their own terminology for the weapon, the fire that burns souls. Survivor accounts describe adults who became catatonic after losing their families to the flames and entire communities that ceased to function after experiencing the horror of systematic incineration. Frozen Hell, the chosen reservoir death trap. November 1950 brought temperatures that plunged to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, transforming the Korean peninsula into a frozen hellscape where Chinese forces would orchestrate one of military history's most diabolical environmental ambushes. At the chosen reservoir, 120,000 Chinese troops under General Song Shirong turned winter itself into a weapon, creating conditions so brutal that frostbite became as deadly as enemy bullets. Chinese forces allowed 15,000 UN troops, primarily the 1st Marine Division, to advance deep into North Korea's mountainous interior, then encircled them during a blizzard that dropped visibility to mere feet. The Chinese had spent weeks acclimating to the conditions, building positions in the frozen ground and stockpiling supplies. Their opponents, equipped for temperate warfare, found themselves trapped in an Arctic nightmare. Robert Leckie, a military author, described the horror. The Chinese attacked at night when the temperature hit -35. The rifles froze solid. You couldn't work the bolt. The batteries and radios died within minutes. Men's breath froze in their beards, forming ice masks that had to be broken off to speak. Some guys froze to death standing up, still holding their weapons. The Chinese exploited every aspect of the brutal conditions. They timed attacks to coincide with the coldest periods. Knowing UN equipment would malfunction while their own troops, dressed in quilted uniforms and felt boots, remained mobile, Chinese soldiers would crawl through snow drifts to within grenade range, then emerged suddenly to attack frozen defenders who could barely move their fingers. Commander Eugene Franklin Clark documented the physiological horror. We had Marines with third-degree frostbite who didn't realize they were injured because the cold had killed all sensation. Men would try to fire their weapons and discover their trigger fingers had frozen off. Others had feet that shattered like glass when they tried to walk. The Chinese knew exactly what they were doing. They were using the weather to disable us before they attacked. The retreat from Chosin became a 78-mile nightmare march through enemy territory in sub-zero conditions. Chinese forces harassed the withdrawal with continuous attacks, forcing the Marines to fight rearguard actions while carrying frostbitten casualties on improvised stretchers. Equipment had to be abandoned when metal became too cold to touch without protective gear that most units lacked. The Chinese psychological warfare intensified the physical torture. They broadcast propaganda through loudspeakers, playing recordings of American popular music mixed with messages encouraging surrender. They would attack aid stations, treating frostbite victims, knowing that wounded men would freeze to death within hours if not properly treated. Chinese snipers specifically targeted officers and medics, understanding that leadership breakdown would accelerate unit disintegration. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Harrison, a Marine who was captured as a prisoner of war, wrote in his journal, "They're not just trying to kill us. They're trying to break us down piece by piece. Every time we get warm, they attack. Every time we try to help the wounded, they shoot our medics. They want us to watch each other freeze to death. They want us to give up being human." The statistical horror was staggering. Of the 15,000 UN troops at Chosin, 17,843 became casualties, more than 100% because wounded men were counted multiple times as their conditions worsened. Frostbite casualties exceeded battle wounds by 3 to 1. The 7th Marines alone had 2,800 frostbite cases, with 800 men requiring amputations. Chinese forces suffered an estimated 40,000 casualties, but they had accomplished their objective, demonstrating that environment could be weaponized as effectively as any conventional arms. Music throughout 1951. As battle lines stabilized into bloody stalemate, Chinese and North Korean forces perfected perhaps their most morally devastating tactic, the systematic use of civilian refugees as human shields and deception tools. This strategy transformed South Korea's displaced population into unwitting combatants, forcing UN commanders into impossible moral decisions that would result in massacres of innocents. The tactic exploited Western humanitarian principles with calculated precision. Chinese and North Korean forces would deliberately intermingle with refugee columns using civilian crowds as cover for troop movements and supply operations. They dressed soldiers in civilian clothes, had them carry enemy weapons concealed in refugee bundles, and positioned military equipment among civilian vehicles and carts. General John Mallis of the 27th Infantry Regiment documented the horrific dilemma. Intelligence reported enemy infiltration in every refugee group. We couldn't tell who was civilian and who was military. A grandmother carrying a baby might have grenades hidden in her bundle. A wounded man on a stretcher might be a sniper waiting for the right moment. The enemy was turning our own humanity against us. The tragedy escalated when orders came from the highest levels to treat all refugees as potential threats. U.S. forces to guard against infiltrators had adopted a policy of shooting refugees approaching their lines and a series of orders from U.S. commanders to fire on all civilians. "Refugees are fair game," said the 1st Cavalry Division's Major General Hobart Ray. The no-gun massacre exemplified the tactic's horrific consequences. From July 26 to 29, 1950, members of the 7th Cavalry Regiment killed an estimated 400 South Korean refugees under a railroad bridge near the village of No Gunri. Survivors described days of terror. Yang Hai-chan later testified, The American soldiers told us to go under the bridge for safety. Then they started shooting from both ends. People were screaming. My mother pushed me under bodies to hide. I lay there for 3 days drinking rainwater mixed with blood. Sergeant James Carnes, who participated in the chaos, later admitted, "We were told the refugees were infiltrated with North Korean soldiers. Every group we saw was supposed to be enemy. After a while, you couldn't tell anymore." The Chinese and North Korean forces documented and exploited these massacres for propaganda purposes, filming the aftermath and broadcasting footage to demonstrate American brutality. They had successfully forced UN troops to commit atrocities, then used those atrocities to justify their own methods and recruit more fighters. The psychological toll on UN forces was devastating. Soldiers reported nightmares about killing civilians, complete breakdowns when encountering refugee groups, and a pervasive sense of moral contamination. Medical personnel documented unprecedented levels of combat stress related to civilian casualties. Dr. Albert Glass, the 8th Army's chief psychiatrist, reported, "We're seeing a new category of war neurosis, moral injury so severe that soldiers lose their capacity for ethical judgment. They've been forced to make survival decisions that violate their fundamental beliefs about right and wrong. Some never recover." The tactic's effectiveness extended beyond immediate military gains. By forcing UN troops to commit atrocities against civilians, Chinese and North Korean forces created lasting propaganda victories, damaged troop morale, and established precedents for civilian targeting that would influence warfare for decades. They had weaponized innocence itself, turning the protection of civilians from a moral imperative into a tactical liability. The breaking of minds, psychological torture, and indoctrination. Behind the barbed wire of prisoner of war camps scattered across North Korea and China, captives perfected techniques of psychological destruction so sophisticated, so systematically brutal that they would fundamentally alter understanding of human mental resistance. The Chinese and North Korean treatment of UN prisoners represented not merely violation of Geneva Convention protocols, but the deliberate application of scientific principles to break human consciousness itself. The process began with capture. Master Sergeant William Olson, who survived 34 months in captivity, described the initial phase. "They didn't just take you prisoner. They took your identity. Within hours, they'd stripped you naked, taken your dog tags, your personal items, anything that connected you to who you were. Then they'd make you stand in stress positions for hours while they asked the same questions over and over. What is your name? What is your unit? Why are you killing Korean people?" Chinese interrogators trained in Marxist psychological principles employed systematic techniques designed to induce cognitive breakdown. Prisoners were placed in solitary confinement for weeks at a time, given barely subsistence rations, and subjected to temperature extremes that prevented sleep. The combination of isolation, malnutrition, and exhaustion created mental states where reality became malleable. The indoctrination process was methodical in its cruelty. Colonel Frank Schwabel, the highest-ranking Marine captured, later testified about his treatment. "They would keep you awake for days, then suddenly show kindness, a warm meal, a blanket, a conversation about home. Just when you started to feel grateful, they'd return to interrogation. They were training you to associate relief with cooperation, pain with resistance." Chinese camp commanders implemented what they called thought reform, a process where prisoners were forced to participate in their own psychological destruction. Men were required to write daily confessions acknowledging their crimes against the Korean people, participate in group criticism sessions where they denounced fellow prisoners, and attend lectures on communist ideology that lasted 8 hours daily. Private Robert Johnson documented this systematic breakdown in his secret diary. "They make you confess to things you never did until you start to believe you did them. They make you inform on your buddies until you can't look them in the eye. They make you repeat their propaganda until you find yourself thinking their thoughts. They're not trying to convert you. They're trying to destroy who you were." The psychological techniques employed specific methods of mental manipulation. Sleep deprivation was scientifically calibrated enough to prevent coherent thought, but not enough to cause immediate death. Food was used as a reward system, with cooperation earning additional calories and resistance resulting in starvation rations. Physical exercise was eliminated to reduce testosterone and increase susceptibility to suggestion. This constant physical stress combined with mental pressure created neurological conditions where normal decision-making processes became impossible. The most devastating aspect was the systematic destruction of group loyalty. Chinese interrogators identified prisoner hierarchies, then used bribes, threats, and torture to turn prisoners against each other. Senior officers were forced to give orders that benefited their captives. Chaplains were made to denounce religion, and medical personnel were required to participate in interrogation sessions. Major William Mayer, who studied American PS after repatriation, documented unprecedented psychological damage. These men weren't just tortured. They were systematically reconstructed. Their personalities were disassembled and rebuilt according to their captive specifications. Some never recovered their original identity. Others spent decades trying to remember who they had been before capture. The propaganda success was devastating to American morale. Recordings of American prisoners denouncing the war effort were broadcast worldwide. Photographs showed captured pilots signing confessions to using biological weapons. Letters written by prisoners praising their treatment and condemning American policy appeared in communist publications globally. 21 American prisoners refused repatriation after the armistice, choosing to remain with their captives rather than return home. These men, dubbed turncoats by American media, represented the ultimate success of Chinese psychological warfare, the complete conversion of enemy soldiers into willing collaborators. Captain Theodore Harris, who eventually returned to America, described the lasting psychological damage. They didn't just break you in captivity, they broke you forever. Years later, I'd find myself thinking their thoughts, doubting my own memories, wondering if maybe they were right about America, about the war, about everything. They planted seeds of doubt that grew for decades. The techniques developed in Korean War PS would later influence interrogation methods used by intelligence agencies worldwide. The systematic breakdown of human resistance, the use of psychological pressure rather than physical torture, and the manipulation of basic human needs became templates for future psychological warfare operations. The stalemate of attrition when brutality became routine. By 1952, the Korean War had devolved into a grinding stalemate that stretched across the peninsula's narrow waist, transforming the conflict from a war of movement into a static nightmare of trench warfare that rivaled World War I's Western Front in its bloody futility. Along the 155-mile front line, both sides had constructed elaborate defensive systems where death became industrialized and brutality evolved from exceptional tactic to daily routine. The Chinese and North Korean forces, now unified under Chinese command, perfected defensive warfare that maximized casualties while minimizing territorial exchange. They constructed tunnel systems so extensive that entire regiments could move underground, emerging behind enemy lines without warning. These tunnels, carved through solid rock by forced labor, contained hospitals, supply depots, and command centers that could sustain prolonged siege. Lieutenant Colonel William Harris of the 2nd Infantry Division recorded the horror of tunnel warfare. You take a hill after 3 days of fighting, count your dead, then discover the enemy had simply retreated underground. The next morning, they'd emerge from holes we never knew existed and retake the same ground. We were fighting ghosts who lived in the earth itself. The Chinese employed rotating tactics that kept UN forces in constant psychological pressure. Fresh divisions would replace exhausted units every few weeks, while American and Allied forces remained in continuous combat for months. This created severe morale disparities where rested Chinese soldiers faced increasingly desperate and psychologically damaged opponents. Artillery became the war's primary killer, with both sides developing tactics specifically designed to maximize psychological trauma rather than tactical advantage. Chinese forces employed systematic harassment campaigns where small artillery strikes would occur every few minutes around the clock, preventing sleep and creating constant stress. UN forces responded with massive bombardments that obliterated entire ridge lines only to discover Chinese forces had simply moved deeper underground. Master Sergeant Robert Thompson described the psychological breakdown. They drop a single mortar round every 10 minutes all night long. Not enough to cause major casualties, but enough to keep everyone awake, on edge, waiting for the next one. After weeks of this, men started having nervous breakdowns just from hearing incoming artillery in the distance. The winter of 1952 to 53 brought new levels of systematic cruelty. Both sides deliberately targeted medical facilities, understanding that wounded men who couldn't be treated would demoralize entire units. Chinese snipers specialized in wounding rather than killing, knowing that wounded soldiers required multiple men to evacuate and created additional psychological pressure on their comrades. Supply warfare became another avenue for psychological torture. Chinese forces would allow UN supply convoys to reach forward positions, then attack during the return journey when vehicles were empty and guards were relaxed. This created constant anxiety around logistical operations and forced commanders to choose between adequately supplying forward positions and protecting supply personnel. The brutalization extended to prisoner exchanges and casualty recovery. Both sides began booby-trapping bodies left in no man's land, turning the basic human decency of recovering fallen comrades into potentially lethal operations. Wounded soldiers were sometimes left deliberately exposed to draw rescue attempts that became opportunities for sniper attacks. The stalemate's psychological toll created new categories of mental breakdown. Military psychiatrists documented positional neurosis, a condition where soldiers became incapable of leaving their bunkers even when ordered. Artillery psychosis affected men who became catatonic at the sound of incoming shells. Tunnel paranoia caused soldiers to obsessively dig deeper positions, convinced that surface warfare had become impossible. Combat effectiveness declined dramatically as both sides adapted to industrialized brutality. Units that had fought effectively during the war's mobile phase became progressively less capable as the stalemate wore on. American casualty reports from late 1952 showed that psychiatric casualties exceeded battle wounds for the first time in military history. The war's final phase saw both sides employing tactics purely for psychological rather than tactical effect. Chinese forces would launch massive attacks they knew would fail simply to demonstrate their willingness to accept casualties. UN forces responded with bombardments, designed more to demoralize than destroy, creating a cycle of violence that served no strategic purpose beyond inflicting maximum psychological damage on enemy forces. The armistice ending hell without peace. On July 27, 1953, at 10 a.m., the guns finally fell silent across Korea as representatives signed an armistice agreement at Panmunjom that would officially suspend, but not end 3 years of unprecedented brutality. The document signed in a hastily constructed wooden building in the demilitarized zone represented not victory for either side, but mutual exhaustion from a conflict that had consumed over 3 million lives and transformed warfare itself. The negotiations leading to this moment had been as brutal as the war itself. For 2 years, while fighting continued along the front lines, diplomats haggled over prisoner repatriation, territorial boundaries, and war crimes accountability. Chinese negotiators led by General Nam Il systematically exploited every humanitarian gesture, using prisoner exchanges as propaganda opportunities and prolonging talks whenever military pressure decreased. The final sticking point revealed the war's psychological devastation: prisoner repatriation. Unlike previous conflicts where prisoners were automatically returned, thousands of Chinese and North Korean captives refused repatriation, choosing exile rather than return to communist territories. Similarly, 21 American prisoners elected to remain with their captives, representing the ultimate success of Chinese psychological warfare techniques. Colonel James Hanley, who supervised prisoner processing, documented the human wreckage. These weren't soldiers anymore. They were broken human beings who had been systematically reconstructed by their captors. Some American prisoners couldn't remember their own names. Others spoke more Chinese than English. The enemy hadn't just defeated them. They had replaced their personalities entirely. The armistice created the demilitarized zone, a 60 m long, 2.5 m wide strip of territory that would become one of the world's most militarized borders. Despite its name, within this zone, both sides constructed massive fortification systems, deployed hundreds of thousands of mines, and established observation posts for continuous surveillance. The DMZ became a permanent scar across Korea, a physical manifestation of the war's failure to resolve the issues that had caused it. The human cost was staggering and deliberately obscured by both sides. American military records documented 36,574 combat deaths, but excluded the thousands who died from exposure, disease, and psychiatric breakdown. Chinese casualties were estimated at 400,000 dead, though accurate records were never released. North Korean military deaths approached 200,000, while South Korean forces lost approximately 58,000 men. Civilian casualties dwarfed military losses. An estimated 2.5 million Korean civilians died during the conflict, approximately 10% of the peninsula's entire population. The systematic use of napalm artillery bombardment of civilian areas and deliberate targeting of refugee columns had created a humanitarian catastrophe that exceeded anything seen in modern warfare. The physical destruction was equally comprehensive. UN bombing campaigns had destroyed 85% of North Korea's buildings, eliminated most major infrastructure, and rendered vast agricultural areas uninhabitable. South Korea fared little better, with major cities like Seoul changing hands 4 times and suffering near total destruction. The peninsula's industrial capacity built during Japanese occupation was completely eliminated. The psychological damage would prove more lasting than physical destruction. Veterans on all sides reported unprecedented levels of mental trauma. American psychiatric hospitals documented new categories of mental illness related to Korean War service: positional psychosis from static warfare, environmental paranoia from booby trap exposure, and moral injury syndrome from civilian casualties. Chinese veterans, despite victory propaganda, suffered similar psychological damage. Reports smuggled out of China described widespread mental illness among Korean War veterans, including mass suicide incidents and violent breakdown episodes. The systematic brutality that had characterized Chinese tactics had damaged perpetrators as severely as victims. Korean civilians bore the deepest psychological scars. Civilians who survived napalm attacks were left with permanent terror of aircraft sounds. Families separated by the DMZ developed what psychiatrists termed separation trauma, a condition where survivors became incapable of forming new emotional attachments. Entire communities ceased to function normally, with survivors exhibiting collective symptoms of severe depression and anxiety. The war's technological and tactical innovations would influence military doctrine for decades. The systematic use of psychological warfare, environmental exploitation, and civilian targeting became standard practices in subsequent conflicts. The Korean War had not simply been brutal. It had been a laboratory where the boundaries of human cruelty were systematically explored and expanded. By the time the armistice was signed, Korea had become something unprecedented in human history. A nation where an entire population had been subjected to systematic brutalization by multiple armies employing the most scientifically developed methods of human destruction ever devised. The conflict had not simply been a political or military failure. It had been a comprehensive assault on human dignity that left no participant unchanged. The silence that fell over Korea on July 27, 1953 was not the peace of resolution, but the exhaustion of societies that had pushed human cruelty to its absolute limits. In the scorched valleys, the frozen mountains, and the blood-soaked trenches of Korea, combatants had discovered that there were no boundaries to the depths of brutality that human beings could inflict upon each other when survival demanded the complete abandonment of humanity itself. Music.